It's been a really long time since I felt like I had a country. And I think that's something that a lot of people, um, whether you are American or not, maybe are starting to feel, but you haven't really come to understand it uh, in those particular words. And I'm talking about something that goes even beyond the world around you just looks different from the way you grew up with. You might even be in a European country and you're seeing way too many immigrants all at once coming in, living in a completely alien and different life than your own. And that's not to make even a moral judgment. It's just a statement of fact, right? That their ways, their expectations, their norms are just really different from what you grew up with, right? And you don't have to, I think, assert that you're better or morally more just than they are to recognize that simple fact. Okay. Um, so we have that kind of reality. Um, and I'm not even just talking about that. I'm not talking about immigrants. I'm not talking about the fact that these stores and restaurants that you grew up with are no longer there, although that's probably the case. I'm not talking about those things necessarily only, though they are a stark and clear part of what I'm talking about. When I ask you about this idea, about this feeling that you don't have a country any longer, what I'm really pointing at is a lack of actual governing. Okay. Because if we think about what a country is, as opposed to merely a polity, as opposed to a empire, as opposed to a generic, I suppose you can say community, but even in that case, you might mean crowd rather. What I'm talking about is a country that means something like a nation state. Okay. And so those are two aspects of it. What we really mean by country usually is a nation state to distinguish it from something like an empire, which has multiple nations within it, which has maybe multiple states within it. Okay. I have a problem with the term United States of America because I don't think there are 50 states. I think there are 50 semi-autonomous zones, which themselves are split into smaller semi-autonomous zones. For example, if you live in, say, San Francisco, that's a city that has some semi-autonomy, okay, but it's a larger part of San Francisco County. And that county, each of these counties is part of California, right? So they derive their authority from California. They don't get to have their own army. They don't have complete control over their laws. Their citizens or residents are taxed by another government above it. Okay, so if you are an American citizen, you have not only several layers of government above you, but you shouldn't think that if you live in New York, you are a citizen of a polity called New York City or New York State, but you are a citizen of the polity known as America. Okay, and America is not a country. Right, it's not a country because if you look at what a country is, it's a nation state, and if we look at those words very carefully, we think about nation. That points us to some notion of ethnicity. Okay, and so if you look at, I mean, there's a couple of ways to look at these things. We could look at this in terms of English etymology. We could also look at this, which I think is typically informative. We could look at Chinese etymology. And the thing about Chinese is that there's two benefits in looking at Chinese. Even if you are an English speaker, even if you were raised in an English speaking culture, the two benefits are this. One, it's a very, very old language. All right. So since it's so old, we have a lot of these concepts being formated or formulated, being formed into some really coherent concept. All right. The second reason is because it is so visual. right? So if you look at, say, the Chinese word for state, you can actually find smaller characters within it that act as a kind of breakdown of elements within a larger concept. All right. So, like in law, right? If you're going to accuse somebody of first degree murder, it can be broken down into many different elements, right? There's a homicide, right? One man or one human being caused the death of another, right? There's an intent element, right? Which would distinguish it from, say, manslaughter, which is unintentional. Okay. There's different elements to proving this crime. Okay. So the concept is one, but it could be broken down into different elements. Okay. Each of which must be present for it to be considered that larger concept, right? So if you have one man killing another, right, but you lack the mens rea, right, the intent requirement, the element, then it is not murder. Okay, so you could do that with other words. You could do that with the word of state, and you could do that actually pretty easily in Chinese, because if you look at the Chinese word for state, you have other words like water, spear, mouse, region, sovereign, right? You have like other kinds of interrelated words there within that, right? And then so you could try to understand what is actually involved. All right. Okay. So those are informative things. But let's look at what a country is. Okay. So a country, let's take a step back from the Chinese. Okay. A country, we think about a nation state. Okay. Now, I think that you can still claim to have uh, a country, even though it's multi-ethnic, right? We could kind of discuss a little bit about that. But let's start with the idea of a state. What is a state? Basically, if we're going to think about these either in direct or analogical terms, we have land, right? That's like a border. It's protected, right? That's the idea of something like a spear, right? Um, we have people in it, okay? And those are represented by potentially mouths, right? So in other words, not only are there people in it, you are responsible for them. You're at least responsible for making sure that they can have something to eat, right? Such that a state where people are chronically starving or that the population is fleeing is a failing state or even a failed state, right? We, of course, have land, which is being protected, right? This is where the idea of regions and borders are involved. We have this idea of a sovereign, okay? So this is the first thing where we can see that America lacks a true state, okay? Because not only is there literally a lack of lordship, right? There's no sovereign, there's no monarch, okay? The government is just so dysfunctional. It doesn't even have sort of a replacement for a human monarch, right? The institution has no consistent character to it, unlike a human being, okay? It doesn't even model virtue, because if we look at the Constitution of the United States, and we'll get to that later on, the problems of the Constitution, it's not actually your friend, all right? Originally, the Constitution was written and in order to serve the advances of the wealthy, okay? And then there were rebellions against it, believe it or not. Okay, one of them is called the Whiskey Rebellion. All right, anyways, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. So you have this idea of leadership. You also have this idea of borders. Now, for a long time now, okay, it's gotten really severe, let's say in the Biden administration, but that's not really the beginnings of it, okay? Because if you remember, Ronald Reagan um, basically did amnesty, right? There were a lot of people who are unlawfully in the United States, particularly in places like California, and he basically granted them amnesty, meaning like, okay, you can stay here as if you are citizens, all right? And of course, you have birthright citizenship. So you have these people from outside coming in unlawfully, jumping the border, trespassing, and then because they have children here, now they are they, or at least their lineage, is fixed in there, right? No matter the fact that they are raised very differently, no matter the fact that they came in through a crime, okay? Normally, right? If somebody steals something and gives you that object, do you own it, right? Regardless of what the law says. Okay, I can talk about what the law is, right, and how it questions that notion, but you know that it's not really right for you to keep. Okay, so why would it change for citizenry, right? We could talk again about what the 14th Amendment really is, and that's being debated right now. However, in terms of actual justice, it's not really just for somebody's ancestor to come here unlawfully and then have children, and then that's how you get to have these benefits and privileges of those of a citizen or subject in this state, right? So, in this sense, in two ways, we don't really have a state. We have such a dysfunctional government, and you have all these immigrants coming in. If that's the case, then you don't have a state. What about nation? Okay, if you look at nation, both in English terms or in the Chinese, it regards this idea of family, which points to this idea of ethnicity. Okay, because the family, okay, you have different actually scopes of family. All right, so you have your intermediate family, your immediate family. I mean, your immediate family is also called a nuclear family, right? That's mom, dad, siblings, right? Your parents and your siblings is your immediate family. It's the one that you typically live with. Okay. Um, so you have this immediate family, then you have your extended family. You can think of that as your clan, right? It used to be in certain parts of history, this was a really big deal. You wouldn't only just spend a lot of times with your uncles and cousins, but also there was authority exercised within the family clan unit. And then, if you think about it, we have something called ethnicity. So, for example, if you are Anglo, if you are Japanese, if you are Han, if you're Korean, if you're Italian, if you're Sicilian, right? These can be considered ethnicities. They're not quite at the scale of race. But what is an ethnicity? You could think of it as an extended family. Now, do you need to be literally ethnically homogenous for you to have a country? I'm going to say that this is debatable. Okay, I'm going to say not easy yes or no. I think it's much easier. It is definitely much easier if you are ethnically homogenous. However, I don't think this means you don't have a country just because that's the case. Why? Because ethnicity is a little blurry, right? It's not really entirely clear. You could actually look at Koreans and say there's actually several, one or two ethnicities within Korea. Same thing with Japan. Okay, two or three. Okay, um, so you could actually say it's a little bit there, but I think there still needs to be something of a family spirit. Okay. In other words, if your so-called country has a bunch of these groups, not only do they look different by, say, skin tone or facial structure, but they also think of themselves as different. Like whites are just not the same as blacks, right? It's a big deal. They have their own histories. Then you don't have the spirit, family spirit anymore, right? You don't even have to think yet in terms of an ethnicity. You don't have a community that acts like a family, right? Now, notice that if you have a lord, it could kind of, that kind of overlaps here, right? A lord allows you to have a functioning state. A lord also implies a kind of family structure to it, right? Because the lord is the father of the community, all right? So the lord is a father figure. The king is a father figure to the country, all right? Not literally the father, but a similar leadership figure in the sense that the father wants what's best for his children, takes care of his children, feeds his children, raises them to be virtuous. So raises them both materially, physically, and morally, right? Let's say put it this way: materially and spiritually, physically and morally, right? Or sorry, physically and spiritually, materialistically and morally, right? It raises a father figure wants these things for their children figures, right? So king and subject, father and children. All right. So However, if you don't have that family spirit, because maybe what is supposed to be a country really acts like a marketplace, really acts like a casino, really acts like a shopping mall where you happen to rent your home, right? Because you might be kicked out of your home if you can't afford it. Like you can't afford the not just the rent, but let's say the mortgage, right? If you are a so-called homeowner, you can't afford the property tax. What happens? You get kicked out. You lose your home. Is it really your home, right? Countries in the past they have something called serfdom, and that had its drawbacks, but at least you had a home that you wouldn't be kicked off of, right? You could live in the same land that your ancestors lived in. You wouldn't be kicked out of it. Now you had to, pay taxes to your lord and serve your lord, but at least you couldn't lose home. So, in this sense, in a very etymological sense, America is not a country. It is an empire, okay? But even the term empire can mean multiple things, right? You can have an imperial country, right? Arguably, I don't want to get into the term empire. I'm not, um, I think that this term has been kind of overused, and it's actually not a Chinese term. It's actually a Roman term, and their term for empire um, really stems from this idea of a certain kind of leadership, and so it's not really worth going into. Does that make sense to you? Would you um, do you see kind of why I'm not talking about this here?
Yeah, it's way more complicated.
Yeah, it's not it's kind of an unnecessary area of complication, right? We have to talk about what an empire is, but an empire you could think of it just broadly in terms of a multi-ethnic polity, right? That that it tends to be expansionist, but it's not necessarily expansionist. Okay, so it doesn't really help us to figure out whether we have a country or not. Okay, so let's talk about hegemony, however. So if you look at hegemony, right, you have this idea, right? If we kind of combine some of these English and Chinese ideas of hard power, force, right, physical force, like a mighty military, right, and what the Chinese might call in classical Chinese leverage, right, like a lever, um, or what the West might call soft power. But they're kind of similar ideas. Like you're not directly committing violence to enforce what you want. You're going to use something like almost manipulation, right? Kind of like some kind of bonus, some way of saying, okay, if you work with us these ways, you get more access to money, right? Or we just make ourselves look really, really attractive in general. Okay. The thing about hegemons or hegemony is that you inevitably slide into deception. Okay. Because your motivation has generally been not ran. Okay. The Chinese word for, I guess you could say, what's most noble about human goodness, right? Virtue, love, mercy. These things are all connected, compassion, benevolence. Okay. Um, Humanity, right? What we might be saying, like, what we mean by saying, oh, the humanity, right? Or like, be a human being, right? That's Ren. Okay. Even though human beings are naturally, by birth, insufficient. What we mean by Ren is the best of humanity, right? What's good about humanity? What's good about human beings? Okay. E is righteousness, right? So um, a hegemony um, exerts power and influence over its neighbors. Okay. But its motivation primarily is about advantage. Okay. Power, not red, not righteousness, not justice. Okay. So to the extent it emulates justice, it emulates righteousness, right? Maybe it talks in terms of righteousness. Maybe it talks about human rights or something like that rather than actual justice. Okay, because I think human rights is a really paltry way to understand things. Um, at the very least, you want to use the term human dignity, and that's a very minimal basis. We haven't even really gotten to higher things like the cultivation of good culture, moral culture, beautiful culture. Okay. Anyways, the thing about hegemony is that they're motivated by power and advantage and profit, money. Okay. So they emulate goodness, but they're actually not good. Okay. And that inevitably slides into deception. Why? Because the situation is always changing. Whether we're talking about the global situation, the internal situation, it's always shifting. Okay. So because the situation shifts, your ability to exert power shifts. And then because you're pursuing advantage, right? One way of seeking advantage is by using deception. So hegemonies can only last only for so long before they are tempted by using deception and will engage in deception. But once you use deception, eventually you're caught, and nobody will believe that you're acting in favor of Ren and E, and nobody's going to trust you, and you cannot lead morally by Ren and E, humanity and righteousness any longer. Okay, so leading by virtue is no longer a thing that you can do at that point. All right, particularly for an institutionally driven polity like America, right? Because our institutions drive where we go. Whereas with the monarchy, at least when the son replaces the father, right? The former king has passed, there's a new king. That new king might have a greater character than his own father, and you could renew trust in the whole country or the whole kingdom. Okay, follow so far here?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, any questions?
Not at the
Anything
moment.
confusing? Okay. Um, so, you know, I think from an etymological standpoint, we could call American Empire, we could call it a hegemony, but we can't call it a country. Right? And I think that's really sad because ultimately, what's our common experience, right? Our common experience is that we've been left out to dry, right? That our government does not any longer protect us as a people, as a whole people, as a common people. It may serve the interests of certain wealthy people, right? That's why Elon Musk, who isn't really an American in the typical sense, okay, gets to become the world's first trillionaire, okay? The stock has dropped enough that he's no longer that, but he could easily become that again, right? So it serves certain wealthy people's interests, but those people can effectively act as a parasite in the sense that they're just extracting resources. They're not improving life. I mean, what has he done that has actually improved your life in a way that really matters, right? So in America, what's happening? Your families are falling apart, your marriages are falling apart, you're being estranged from your parents, from your children. Okay. It's hard to find a job. You can't feed your children. You can't feed yourself. You can't even think of really having children, or the idea of having children or more children really distresses you. Those are all problems that didn't really exist in the past. I mean, yeah, there were times there was the occasional famine, but that's really out of your control. That's even out of your government's control. Nowadays, the government could fix it. Okay. We have enough physical food. We have great technology, great agriculture, techniques and technology, but the state is getting in the way. The government is not doing its job. All right. Whatever exactly you think is a real cure for this, right? More deregulation or more regulation or distribution or more pure free market, whatever, right? Whichever direction, you have to admit that the results speak for themselves. Something is going wrong. Okay. All right. Here's something else. Okay. So America's 250th birthday is 4th of July, right? Okay. So supposedly, because in 1776, a quarter of a millennia ago, kind of a long time, um, you had the Declaration of Independence. However, I'm going to tell you that it doesn't make sense to call this a 250th birthday for a number of reasons, right? First of all, the thing is, there's been multiple Americas. If you look at France, they'll talk about the Fourth Republic, the Fifth Republic, stuff like that. Okay. Um, America has multiple republics too. And you can think about this in a couple of ways. One, the government changed so radically, right? The way it works changed so radically, it's a basically different polity. Okay. Number two, culturally, it changed so radically, it's unrecognizable. Okay. I personally feel like America has changed radically every 50 years. Every 50 years is like a completely different way of life, completely almost unrecognizable. I mean, what's happening today versus what happened in the 1970s, it's like a completely different place. I think you compare 1970s to the 1920s, completely different place. Right? And you can just keep going on with this. Before, you know, another 50, a little more than that, was the Civil War, right? The aftermath of the Civil War. So every 50 years is a completely different experience, right? So we've had multiple republics, but let's make it a little more rigorous. Let's talk about how things change in terms of how the government works. America, who are its founding fathers? It's not really George Washington. It's not these people, not Thomas Jefferson. It's not John Adams. And by the way, they've died 50 years after you know, after 1776, right? The war began, okay, to the very date. And that's interpreted as a positive omen. But if you really think about it, right, if you're told that somebody who was a warlord started a war, and then he on a certain date, and maybe it ended in 5 years, right? He won. But 10 years after the start of that war, he died. I think a lot of people would think that's a bad omen, not a good omen, right? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the very same day, right? Exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. Um, and people could think of it as a good thing. I mean, 50 years is also an interesting number because biblically that's the period of Jubilee, right? Jubilee is basically all the debts are released, right? So it's kind of this time period where in this 50 years, right, you might become a slave, you might be in debt to somebody, you might have sold your ancestral lands, but at the end of those 50 years, it's a reset, you get back. In other words, there's a cosmic rebalancing, or at least a national rebalance. So for somebody to die at the end of these 50 years tells me that's an act of rebalancing, not a honoring. Okay, so it's more likely to be, in biblical terms, a rebuke of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But by the way, Thomas Jefferson is not a Christian, right? He was uh, definitely apostate. He had a version of the Bible. He had a version of the New Testament that crossed out every miracle of Jesus. All right. So if this guy is your hero and you think you're a Christian, you should really think about this. Okay. These guys are Enlightenment people, right? They are not Christian. Okay. George Washington didn't take communion. Okay. So these are all things that are really important for you to know. Okay. All right. So these guys are deists. These are Enlightenment people. There's something to be said about their involvement, particularly Washington's as a Mason. So there's some interesting things there. I'm not going to go really into that. I'm not really that well versed in it. I'm sure you could find some other people who speculate on this very much. Okay. But anyways, let's look at the timeline of American history. You have the real founders. Those are the colonists. Okay. Those are the real founders. And there's some religious motivation, right? There's some Puritans, and the Puritans are not like the people that you're told. They're not like in Scarlet Letter, which was written like 200 years after the actual Puritans go to America. They like colorful things. They weren't just wearing black and white all the time. Okay, they liked colorful things. They had like jewel encrusted spoons and stuff. Okay, they were kind of interesting people. They had different ideas of theology, right? I'm not here to talk about that today. And they had different ideas how to live life based off of those theological disagreements. Okay, so there's some motivation there, but overall, primarily, places like Jamestown was there for commercial endeavors, right? To get lumber, to get fur, to check Spanish Empire expansion. Okay, because this is the age of colonization and empire building, right? there's an empire race, kind of like we had a space race in the 60s. Okay. Um, so you have that going on. Okay. And then later on, tobacco is discovered, and that also becomes part of the trade. Okay. And then it becomes, and by the way, if you want to think about America as having an original sin, it's not actually slavery, it's um, it's greed. Okay. The slavery is a byproduct of that greed, okay? Because they didn't import people from all the way from like East Africa, which is really expensive, right? They didn't import them all the way to America to have this group of people working for them who couldn't even speak English, okay? And they brought them over because they were the ones who could simply were genetically gifted to be able to survive um, subtropical weather, climate, in places like Virginia and more south, right? Because it's really hot, really humid over there. And these crops require labor, fairly intensive labor. And so if you try to have anybody else work there, they will die. They will literally just die, okay, from that. So that's why they paid a huge premium price to get people from halfway across the world there. Okay. So you have the colonial period, okay? America has some de facto independence because it's so far away from Britain, the British mainland, right? The United Kingdoms. So it's very far from there. Furthermore, whenever they have some kind of war going on, like a civil war, they can't really govern these colonies. So these colonies start to practice self-governance. And of course, the easiest way to self-govern will be through democracy, right? That's why, uh, it hasn't really been a common form of government, historically speaking. But also that's why pirates are the ones to reinvent democracy. Okay, and it really works for pirates. Why? Because the goal is very clear. Okay, the goal is very clear, and it's a small community. Okay, and it's very clear whether you achieve that goal or not. Right? The goal is also petty. It's just money. Right? Okay, so that works really well. Now, if you have to deal with harder questions, more abstract questions, and you've got a bigger population, like millions of people, debating ideas of justice, that's not going to work, right? You guys don't get to know each other very well. You can't really debate the opinions very well, and you can't really tell if you really achieve your goal. And the nature of the goal is very difficult to discuss, right? Both intellectually, but also in terms of expressing oneself through language, right? Whereas this is really clear. Were you able to get the gold or not, right? The pirate booty, right? That's very clear. And then you just split it. So, um, that's why democracy can work for pirates. That's why it doesn't really work so well for actual countries. Okay. So, anyways, we have the colonial period. Then there's this war, the so-called Revolutionary War. Newsflash, right? That's not really a revolution because they didn't replace the British monarchy with a new dynasty. Okay. They didn't even establish a new form of government quite yet. They had something called the Articles of Confederation. That's the Second Republic. Okay. Or maybe the First Republic, let's say, because technically the colonies are still part of the British Empire. Okay. Even though they're kind of on a more regular basis acting in independent, more Republican fashion, you don't really get full independence until after that war of what I'm going to call the War of Separation or the War of Secession. Okay, that's going to make certain people mad who are conservative. But if you're really conservative, like from the South, you might actually like this term here, right? This is the original War of Secession, right? This is the successful War of Secession because the colonies, in becoming states, secede from the British Empire. Okay, right, and at this time they're actually states, right? While we're making sure wars according with reality, at this time they really are states because they can issue their own money, they create their own laws, they have their own military forces, okay? And nobody can say you're not allowed to have that without invading them, okay? So at the end of the war, I believe that ends 1783, off the top of my head. You have the British recognizing that, okay, you guys are independent. You guys are no longer part of our empire, right? We'll go. Okay. So you have these 13 colonies, they turn into 13 states. Up north in what's called Canada today, there's still British colonies up there. They're still British, right? They didn't join this war of secession. Okay. All right. So you have the Articles of Confederation. You have 13 independent states that practice full independence. Okay. And then a whole 6 years go by till 1789, where they actually start to have this idea of having a new constitution. No longer the Articles of Confederation, no longer that Congress, okay, that Continental Congress. You have something else, a new, stronger federal government. Now, what is this for? Okay, so in other words, let's go back here. It's not a war of revolution. It's not because they're not establishing a new dynasty. They're not establishing a new form of government, right? They're just seceding. Okay, it's not a real form of government because the Articles of Confederation act like the United Nations do today. It's a place for these different countries to get together, or these different states or polities to get together and discuss agreements, right? To make agreements, to express grievances. It's a discussion platform. It's a discussion forum. Okay, because the UN can't go into America and say, "Oh, we, you're going to follow this law, right? You haven't been following this law that we all agreed to. Now you're going to follow." Even though the federal government, right, can go into, say, California and say you are breaking federal law, right? You need to go change that now. Okay. All right. So does this all follow so far here?
Yes, it does.
Okay. What? Um. So, do you have any questions here? And could you keep your mic on?
I do not have any questions right now.
All right. So you have this thing going on here, right? Where you um, don't really have quite a new government. Okay, so it's most accurately called a war for separation, right? A separatist war. It's more accurately called a war of secession, right? Because that's exactly the war that's being fought in what's called the American Civil War when the South tries to secede from the Union. All right, they failed to do so, but it's the same idea. I mean, they are making their own kind of confederacy, right? Their own kind of unit separate, but we are not really we're not thinking of this as an attempted revolution, right? Because they're not replacing the full government, right? That's my point here. There's no replacement there, okay? And on top of that, the government that is being instituted is not really terribly different, okay? So, um, by the time you get to what's called the Constitution, what we remember as the Constitution, that's 1789, you've got a soft coup. Now I could go through like a lot of the details here, but really the soft coup, basically what happens, there's going to be some inaccuracies in what I'm saying, but I just want to make this simple enough to follow. All right. So basically you have this problem with money. Okay. You've got this continental currency that was printed out and it's not really being accepted and it's not really being redeemable for something that people might actually value, whether it's actual goods and services or something more like traditional money like gold and silver. Okay, there's some difficulty there, right? So what people are doing is that they're paid like these soldiers who fought the war, they're paid in this sort of paper money. Okay, and it's being reduced in value, right? Because it's not being accepted. So it's kind of like a stock that's getting lower and lower in prices. What do? Is it worth zero immediately? No, but it is declining in value. So you sell it off before it gets worse in value. Who buys that up? People who can afford to gamble on the future, speculators, right? So these are currency speculators. Okay, so they buy it up. Meanwhile, the common people are getting poorer and poorer. This is why around this time the states are converting from oligarchy, which means you need to own property to vote, to democracy, which means there's no property requirement. And interestingly, during this time, you even have like, you know, um, women being able to vote, okay, in certain states. You have freed blacks, right? Formerly slaves, but now they're freed. They can vote too, right? Now that eventually goes back to only white males, okay? But for a time being, it was actually fairly broad, fairly liberal for a short period of time. So you have all these people, and they are sometimes they're rioting, sometimes there's a sort of a, you know, um, basically acts of group violence, right? Whether you want to call it a riot or rebellion or whatever, right? And they're being dissatisfied here. Um, and so this is a real uh, um, intention of making a constitution, okay? Because if you look at the constitution, it basically parallels the British system, okay? Instead of a parliament, there's a Congress, and instead of a House of Lords, there's a Senate. Now, the Senate is not hereditary. Um, Instead of a House of Commons, you have the House of Representatives, okay? Instead of a king, you have a presidency, and of course, the presidency is through the Electoral College, voted for or appointed, whatever term you want to use, because here it's a little bit of, uh, well, it is voted for, right? But it is, yeah, it is voted for. Let me just make it simple and say that, okay? But it's not voted for directly, okay? So back then, the Electoral College uses a bit more discretion, okay? And those electors are chosen by the state, okay? So, anyways, again, I'm trying to prevent myself from going into too much detail here. Okay, so you have basically a mirroring of the British system. What the Constitution is really there, though, is to do a few things. One is to establish a permanent standing army and navy. Okay, it's there to also give to the federal government, the new federal government, the ability to tax directly the states. It starts this infrastructure to be able to, if they want to in the future, directly tax individual citizens of any state directly, not through the state, right? But directly as individuals. Okay. That's why we even get amendments in the future, like the income tax one. Even though that's not part of the original Constitution, right? The articles are written which give a structure of government that later allows it the ability to raise money, okay, and even to promote certain amendments, okay, because there's two ways to enact an amendment, okay, and the other one, the conventions, has never really been used in American history, okay, okay. Um, Basically, that mechanism of amendment is extremely difficult to pull off. Right? It's much easier to go through the federal government itself to amend the Constitution. Okay, and even then, that itself is very difficult. Anyways, going too much into detail. My overall point is that these are the real motivations of the Constitution. Okay, is to make the wealthy more wealthy. I'm not joking about this, right? That's actually what it is. If you really carefully look at this, if you look at, for example, Charles Beard, an economic analysis of the Constitution, he makes a very clear case that the people benefiting, who are advocating for the Constitution, who are setting up the Constitution to be the law of the land, who are benefiting from these changes, who are debating these things, right? They are benefiting financially from the Constitution. Okay. And the common people actually figure this out. Okay. And we'll talk about this in a bit, right? So what happens historically? The Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, they authorize people to look into this idea of maybe reforming. Okay. Instead, what they do, again, this is oversimplification, right? Instead, what they do is they all meet in Philadelphia and they board up the walls, they board up the doors, they board up the windows. Okay. And this is like summer. this is when it's really hot, and this is when they're dressed back then, right? They're not wearing like swimsuits or something indoors or something with AC, right? They are wearing very stuffy clothing, right? So it's very hot, very unpleasant. Why are they doing this? Because they know if the common people find out about this, or even the other members, of the so-called Revolutionary War, right? This will be very controversial, and word will get out. Okay, so they're hiding something, obviously, right? And then what they end up doing is they come up with this whole constitution. They don't bother really um, they don't really bother allowing the Continental Congress to debate this. Instead, what they do is they just have this whole conventions. They bring out these conventions, okay, and out of every state. Now, if you know anything about a convention, who goes there? Are they just random people? Are they representative of the whole population, or are they more like the fan base?
They're merely just people who are invited there only. Not everyone's goes
Yeah,
there.
some days they're invited there, or sometimes. And could you leave your mic on here? Actually, I don't want you to stay on mute here. So they are either invited, right? But if you know anything about other conventions, right? Like, you just show up because you're interested, right? So that's the convention, right? So by having these conventions, right, that are not authorized directly, okay, that operate outside even the state government, you have this appearance of a lot of popular demand. Now, the states themselves, the people who lead those states, highly overlap with the pro-constitutionalists. And by the way, they're not all the people who are revolutionists, right? Or really the guys who were fighting the war of 1776. Okay, like Patrick Henry, he was really opposed to the Constitution. Okay, he thought that would destroy states' rights, and he was ultimately right. It would destroy states by basically taking away state power. Okay, in other words, you wouldn't have 13 independent countries anymore. You would just have one big thing. Okay, and he was very aware of that. So he was vehemently opposed to the Constitution, right? So they didn't want a lot of people to know about this until it was too late, until they could create this appearance of lots of popular support for it. In that case, the state, which again is a lot of this leadership are the same people in favor of the Constitution anyway, can go ahead and say, well, we better go ahead and go along with this too. The people demand it. But realistically, the people did not demand it. And we know that because after the Constitution is established and after they start taxing, there are rebellions. There's a Rescue Rebellion that I mentioned earlier. Now, do you know of any incident where the President of the United States actually brought out the army to put down, riots and such?
Well, the Whiskey Rebellion was one of them.
Yes, right. Is the earliest one, and surprisingly, it's George Washington. Okay, so this goes against a lot of the popular imagery of American history, right? Like we have this People's Revolution, right? 1776 is for this ideal government. It's not, right? Then we have this Constitution. Everybody thinks this great thing, this ideal form of government that could be applied all throughout the world. No, all of that is wrong. There was rebellions against this. Okay, at least against the taxes that they try to raise, okay, because they didn't want these not only want to pay these taxes, they thought that these taxes were illegitimate, right? That's to challenge essentially, indirectly at least, the Constitution, if not directly, the Constitution itself. Okay. Now, this Constitution doesn't really work for many reasons. One, we already talked about why democracy doesn't work for a while, but also um, the checks and balances are really askew. Okay, so the Supreme Court is very weak. So Congress has the power to raise money. The presidency has the power of the sword. The Supreme Court really has the power of opinion, and it's been ignored. Do you remember the first president to ignore the judgment of the Supreme Court?
I'm sure there's a famous case for this. It's not ringing a bell right now.
It's Andrew Jackson. Okay,
Uh,
so basically, this is what leads to the Trail of Tears because Georgia wants to Cherokee out. The U.S. has a treaty with the Cherokee Nation, and then so uh, basically they get sued by the Cherokee Nation, and it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, actually, we have to honor our treaties. They should be able to stay. And Georgia decides, well, we're going to kick them out anyway. And Andrew Jackson, the president, says, um, this might be apocryphal, but he's supposed to have said something like, well, um, John Marshall, right, who is the chief judge, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it, right? In other words, he's not going to get in the way of Georgia, right? He could send the Union Army against Georgia, but he chooses not to do it. So the Cherokee get kicked out. They have to go to, I believe, Oklahoma, and you have this Trail of Tears, right, which is considered to be almost a genocidal act, right? So that's what we have here. The Supreme Court is incredibly underpowered. It's basically a tiebreaker, you know? That's why I say you have the three branches of government, and one of them is not really three branches of government, it's two branches and a twig. Okay. Um, and you know, I have this book coming out soon. If you would like to know when it comes out, go ahead and do the whole thing. You know, subscribe, um, like the video, I guess, leave a comment, and I'll make sure that when it comes out, um, that you will be notified and you can read about how the Constitution actually works and its weaknesses and so forth. Okay, it's a whole comprehensive look at it. We're going to look through how the Constitution has changed throughout the different republics, right? 250 years, right? And how it operates and how all these problems that we're facing today as Americans, or if you're not an American, um, you know, basically what America does, right, unfortunately influences you too, right? You can't really escape America. All the dysfunctions in the world, right, we can trace it back to the dysfunctions of the Constitution. Okay. So that's a really important book that you might want to take a look at. Um, all right. So basically, we have this new constitution. It comes out, is really there so that the states can no longer print their own money. They can no longer absolve their own citizens of debt. They can no longer interpret contracts. That's all the federal government, right? So, what's the purpose of it? And by the way, all the debates at these conventions are about paper money and debt and bankruptcy, according to James Madison, who was reporting on that, okay, and corresponding with guys like Thomas Jefferson. They weren't debating stuff like the extent of executive power in the articles, right? Of it, right? Another thing that tells you that this is not this ideal form of government is that the Bill of Rights, right, which is everybody's favorite part of the Constitution, one is not really strongly written, and number two, um, they're amendments. What's an amendment? We're adding this or modifying this after the original document. It's an afterthought, in other words, right? We're just thinking about this after the fact. Okay, so do you see how this is not really an idealistic government being formed here, right? It's a way to restructure power, particularly financial power, away from the states, so that you could back this money that the wealthy have speculated on, right? This paper money that they've speculated on, right? Okay. Speaking of which, speaking of speculation, George Washington, he was a huge speculator. To, to this day, if you adjust for inflation, he is the richest president of all time, including Donald Trump. Okay. He speculated before the War of Separation in 1776. He bought a lot of land in the Ohio River Valley. Okay. I believe Cincinnatus is somewhat a reference to George Washington being the Cincinnatus of his time. I'm probably missaying his name. Sorry, English does not have a phonetic alphabet, you know, a truly phonetic alphabet. You'd have to be Korean to, you know, enjoy that, I suppose. Um, because this alphabet is originally not English, it's just adapted for English purposes, so it's not really perfectly one to one. Anyway, So, anyways, he owns all this land there. Now, one big reason for these revolutionists or these separatists to go to war is that they want to get rid of British authority, right? Because the British authority is getting in the way of money. Now, let me give you two examples. George Washington, like I said, he's a land speculator. He owns a lot of land in the Ohio River Valley, but the British have said you cannot expand westward anymore. We have treaties with the Native Americans, right? You cannot expand anymore. So what happens to that land that he supposedly owns? It drops in value, right? It's worthless now. So he has a lot of money to gain by getting rid of the British, right? John Hancock, he's famous for having the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence. He was a tea smuggler, all right? So he also doesn't really want, you know, he has all these contacts in, I believe, all these Dutch contacts, right? And so he's smuggling in Dutch tea, and he can make a lot more money if the British cool down on their right enforcement um, against importing tea from outside the empire, right? So are high taxes and import fees really, as land speculation, really good justifications for war, for people dying? I don't think so, right? Because today our taxes are way, way, way worse what they had back then. Okay. But we wouldn't really buy into this idea of guys like Elon Musk or whatever, right? Or whoever, right? Saying, well, we should have a revolution, right? So they could make more money. Okay. We wouldn't really be okay with that. So, um, and our taxes, right? Common people's taxes are very high. So, um, these are comparable situations, but nobody really buys into this idea that war is worth it. And yet, back in 1776, America did go to war, right? Um, and back then, right? I mean, how many people really supported this war? About a third. Maybe a third was neutral. Maybe a third were loyal to the crown. So even then, there's a lot of manipulation going on there, right? Okay. So, anyways, we have this new constitution. We have this new republic that lasts until the end of the Civil War, because the Civil War is there. And by the way, with the question of slavery, right? That's actually addressed in the Constitution. I think something like 1804, you're supposed to, or 1802, I can't remember exactly the date. You can no longer import slaves. That's in the Constitution, right? So we're not talking about the ideal form of government. What we're talking about is the sort of way that these states compromise to an agreement to have a more strong federal government, which is still really a way to get wealthier, right? So this is a running theme throughout American history. It's really for the wealthy. America is for the wealthy. Okay. This whole thing about the American dream, that really pisses me off because how is it a dream that I get to have a family and I get to have enough income to feed that family in a safe neighborhood or village? That's just life, right? That's just what a country is supposed to be, whether it's America or not. And you're trying to package this to me as a dream that I'd be lucky to have? Hell no. So I don't know about you, but that really, really makes me angry here. That really pisses me off. Um, anyway, so we have this thing, right, where you have America expand because Thomas Jefferson is an unprincipled man, right? Even though he seems to be principled by getting rid of all of Jesus' miracles in the Bible, um, he talks about the yeoman farmer and a small republic, right? However, if you look at the landmass of the 13 states, the original republic after the Constitution, it's really big already. Okay, but now he's going to take the deal of a lifetime. Okay, the deal of a millennium, right? He's going to buy the rights. And by the way, of course, what we're talking about, right? And we're talking about the rights to this land. We're ignoring the natives there, of course, right? Because even at this time, we recognize historically that the natives, and this is part of America's great fortune as a polity, the natives have very little power compared to Europe, to European powers, right? compared to America. Very little power. Okay, they're an afterthought, right? So the French sell this land, really the rights, right? They're basically saying, okay, we will pretend we can be here, right? So there's this Louisiana Purchase, and that's why we have the ability to go unencumbered by any other European power all the way to California. Okay, as long as as long as the United States, um, and put it back into third person here, right? Rather than speaking from the perspective of the US. Okay. So Thomas Jefferson's thinking, okay, well, I just signed this, right? Now I can go all the way to California unencumbered, right? Or we can go all the way to California unencumbered, right? Except for the natives, right? Now there is the Mexicans, right? There's the Mexicans, which will sort of get in the way of this, okay? But the Mexican-American War is, of course, won by America um, without too much difficulty. And it's one of those wars where the participants in it really question whether this was necessary, whether this was really in quote unquote our best interests, right? Whether this was in the interest of good interest in Americans. But it's an easy enough war where that question doesn't have to be quite pressed, right? So you might have some verbal disagreements, but you won't have riots, right, occurring because of this, because it's a war that can be won relatively easily, right? So people might be upset about it, but they're not going to really be throwing a riot or a rebellion or etc. over it. Okay. So, anyways, America starts to expand, right? And then this creates a lot of difficulties because Congress can technically um, get rid of slavery, right? So that's why we have this need now for, as long as you're expanding, the new states should be 50-50 free states and slave states, because that creates a balance in Congress so that the Congress cannot allow slavery or, uh, later on get rid of slavery through other means. Okay. So that's oversimplification. We haven't talked about how the interstate commerce clause has changed over the time. And during this time, technically, Congress could not affect, you know, commerce with it. But I don't want to really get into that level of detail. Okay. But there was this fear overall that the federal government would get rid of slavery, right? Okay. Anyways, we get to the Civil War. Okay. So you have this very different America between the Constitution and the Civil War that doesn't last terribly long, right? Because that's approximately 1800. Okay. So 1789 is when the Constitution is first written. I think the last one to ratify it, state to ratify, is maybe 1801. Anyways, so um, we have the Constitution operate for some 50 years, approximately, right? So that's that number again, 50 years again. Every 50 years, things are very, very different. Okay. And it seems to work, right? So America never has a golden age, but the thing that it comes, I suppose, closest to would be this, I don't know, I think it's called the era of good feelings by some historians, era of good feelings, and that's about the first 20 years. Okay. But here you have a lot of weird stuff going on. Okay. You have like the Transcendentalist movement. Um, you have a lot of really fierce abolitionism, right? So people are already unhappy that there's slavery. And by the way, by creating one federal government, right, that can actually do something about slavery throughout the states, now this becomes everybody's issue, right? So nowadays, when we think about something like, okay, women's rights in, say, Saudi Arabia, right? We don't really, it's not really a thing that we feel like is our problem, right? People might have their opinions of it in general, but they don't get really too serious. They just go back, they go back to the rest of their day. But if your government can actually do something about it, now it becomes your issue, right? In democracy. Do you follow that here? What I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it's your concern now.
Right, because you could theoretically vote in a certain way. So, anyways, it becomes a hot issue, right? That's kind of another weakness here, um, another problem. So it erupts in the Civil War eventually, And then Civil Wars one was fought. This is the end of states as having any illusion that they're actually their own country, that they're actually a state. So after this point, you have a semi-autonomous zone. Okay, so we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. These collectively basically create a sort of birthright citizenship. Um, is really there to make sure that it's a quick way of making sure that all these people who are formerly slaves are now citizens and they can vote. You have the 14th Amendment, which basically guarantees in very vague language rights to everybody throughout the land. Later on, the Supreme Court uses this in as a sort of incorporation doctrine, where basically they're saying, okay, um, basically what's in the Bill of Rights now applies to the states. So there's a kind of almost a full standardization of rights that citizens have throughout the states. Now, this sounds good, unless you're thinking about it this way. Maybe in certain ways, each state has stronger rights than what the federal government provides. So in that case, you would actually be losing rights, right? Now, some in other cases, um, it simply interferes with the state's ability to govern themselves. Okay. We also have some other problems with the Constitution that are kind of hidden. Like, if California is welcoming these people and raising them to be a certain way, maybe another state doesn't want those Californians in their own place, right? But the Constitution, by this point, prohibits anything of that sort, right? It already did in the original Constitution in 1789. But by this point, any possibility of that kind of thing definitely is over, right? Even the illusion of it is over. Okay. So things are very different by this point. Okay. Later on, you get the progressive movements. This is where you can directly elect your senators. Along this time, you also have the income tax being applied. So by this point, America is also very different. Federal government is stronger and spending more, has the capacity to spend more money. Okay. Um, by the time you get to World War II, all of that is really in severe gear. So they're not changing the Constitution anymore, but they're using what's already in the Constitution and scaling it up. So you have this income tax that maybe wasn't that much. Now it's a lot of tax that you're paying directly to the federal government. Okay. You have all these direct elections that give more power, more democracy, and fuels its efficiency. Okay. Um, it furthermore, um, if if furthermore, because of the industrial revolution that's taking place um, there, okay, you have. Let's go ahead and pause for a bit here, okay. Okay, let's continue here. Actually, I kind of stopped there for a bit to recollect my thoughts here. So um, basically, we have a very different kind of country by the time we get to the world wars. Okay, so America is going to get itself involved in these world wars, and they're not really fought even for um, anything that could be even established as anything close to Americans' interests, right? So by this point, we have an America that is going beyond the continent of America, right? You have this U.S. that has gone over to Japan by now and has threatened them to open up for trade. That causes a lot of issues. Okay, that's in the late 1800s, and then you have one that goes later on into the European back into Europe. Now, a big reason for becoming an American is to, if you're descended from the Europeans, is to avoid European problems, and yet you're going to be asked to die for them on their land, ironically, right? So you have all of this kind of happening. It's a very different republic by this point, okay? Then after World War II, America is playing world superpower, right? There's this whole Cold War thing, and then so the federal government has much, 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 much more power by this point. So everything is very different. Okay. And people are paying through taxes, through inflation. America goes off the gold standards in the 70s. Okay. That creates a lot more inflation there. Um, and so by the time we get to 2001, okay, that we have the the attacks, right, in September of 2011. Okay, and that doesn't even get its own name, right? We still don't have a name for it. Like we don't have a name for it, like the Twin Towers incident or the Twin Towers attack. That might be a better way to put it. Okay, but anyways, it's just referred to as this date, which I think is kind of insidious in its own terms. Sort of like, hey, look, this changed history. Now get on board, right? Get on board with this, right? Because if we just talked about, oh, the day that two buildings collapsed, well, every year, just on traffic accidents alone, every year more people die just based on traffic accidents alone than people die that day because of those two towers collapsing, right? I'm not trying to minimize it, but I'm trying to properly contextualize it. Okay. We make it into this huge deal because this is a way that we have now a state apparatus that has almost infinite control over everything, economically, politically. Okay. And they don't care socially anyway, right? But they have this ability to do almost anything that they want at this point, right? Because now they're looking everywhere. They have all this power, and none of it is transparent. None of this is knowable, right? If you go to an ordinary trial, you can just sit in. Nobody can keep you from just sitting in those chairs, right? Witnessing any trial, as long as there's space, right? You can just sit there and see. But now that's no longer the case. Okay, so you have America changing radically, right? Now I want to talk about, we're about done here with the history. I just want to talk about some themes really quickly. America's family has always had family issues. Okay, why? Because the natural way of living in a family is not your little nuclear family, it's your clan family, right? You are supposed to live with your cousins, with your uncles, right? That's what patriarchy really is, right? That's actually how it's exercised. You're not supposed to live in this small nuclear family with two kids, right? Okay, so by the time when you are establishing the colonies, who are you coming with? You're not coming with your whole clan. You're coming as nuclear families and another with other nuclear families. All right. Then, as you expand westward, you can't regrow a clan, right? You could, if you stay there, regrow clans, and some Americans have, okay, from time to time. But if you're constantly expanding westward, those clans are being split up back into nuclear units again. All right. After you expand westward, you have this very large landmass and a national economy because the Constitution ensures that your states can no longer have tariffs or any kind of ways to grow local economies and keep your people happily within it, right? So now you're at this point where, in order to get a job, you might have to move not only the city but the whole state. Okay, so that keeps these families atomized, right? Very small, right? Very stretched out. You don't really get to know your cousins. You won't depend on your larger family. You don't have a clan family to fall back on in hardship, all right? Okay, so that fuels the power of the state because the state is what steps in and also takes advantage of and also reduces the power of large families. All right, does that all, I know I said that very quickly, but does that all make sense here?
Yes, it does.
Okay, any questions about that so far?
Um, not really. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about religiosity, okay? Because this is one more thing, this is the last thing I want to talk about. From time to time, you have this America that seems to be very Christian. There's a few things to say about this. One, this is not mostly real Christianity. Okay, you have these like great awakenings, okay? And there's like the first one was partly British back in England and and throughout, I would say maybe Britain, but it was also here in America. And every time you have these great awakenings, you have these new denominations and sometimes almost what you could call new religions, right? Like Seventh Day Adventism, I think is the second or third great awakening. Okay, Jehovah's Witnesses. All right, The Mormons are not really technically part of that, but this is kind of part of the same problem, right? These guys are making up their own even scriptures. Okay, they have their own scriptures, right? And so is it Christianity in some ways? I guess you could say so, right? But it's um, really they have their own scriptures. Okay, so that makes them very different. But you have these disagreements, not just disagreements, but these sort of new churches. The reason this is happening is because you have a really disorderly and chaotic country, right? Because the family is disintegrating. Okay, things are changing very rapidly with technology, with expansion, with politics. Okay, like I said, every 50 years, America is completely different, not even recognizable. Okay, just completely different. It's like somebody who looks beautiful, and then she goes to Hollywood and gets a bunch of, you know, plastic surgery, right? And looks completely different. That's what America is like by every 50 years, right? And it's not immediate, right? It's gradual, but by every 50 years, it's a completely different experience. Okay. Um, Ask anybody who's a boomer, right? We're really different in America, right? You don't have to agree that it got worse or better, but you have to acknowledge it's completely different, right? So that rapid change brings with it its own innate, inherent disorder and chaos. All right. And because you have broken families, okay, because you have really unrecognizable life, people seek God, but people are going to seek God on their own terms, okay, because most people are not interested in truth. And whenever you have these religious movements, they're so really American, right? They're American in some kind of way, right? Maybe they're hyper individualistic, right? Maybe they are conceiving of things in terms of rights and equality, right? They're not really biblical. They're not looking at the Bible as its own literature, as something that goes beyond your particular culture. They're not even looking at the Bible to tell them, oh, culturally, they are fundamentally wrong. Okay, because a lot of these so-called American ideals, right, individualism, freedom, equality, they're actually um, anti-biblical, right? You can look at, I've talked about this before, but we talked about how, the snake, right, in the Garden of Eden, the serpent is really couching these things in terms of freedom and equality, right? You will be like gods, right? So you're equal to God, right? And then you get to decide for yourself what is good and evil, right? That's freedom, right? That's kind of like ultimate freedom. So you have that, and of course it creates chaos because God's order is not built on freedom and equality, right? Freedom from evil is good, but freedom as its own thing is not something that should be highly valued. Okay, so you have these sudden bouts of religiosity, but the Christianity is not really genuine. Okay, right now I would say we have our own kind of maybe what is it? I guess the fifth or even sixth great awakening. Okay, we have our own kind of great awakening, but it's maybe more of a mild kind of thing because a lot of people are becoming more so-called Christian. But if you look at how they actually behave, what they really believe, they really more believe in some kind of really aggressive. Um, I don't want to say masculinity because to me, masculinity is not really about aggression, right? Um, but some of these guys believe in like colonialism again and stuff like that, like really ridiculous stuff. And they're not really genuinely Christian. And it's important to recognize that. So, you know, I want to ask you, we kind of talked about various titles. I don't know what we're going to go for. We might recycle some of these, but I wanted to go with a brief history of America. But also, I thought, it's the 4th of July. Do you know where your country is? Right? Because if you look at this, if you have a world that doesn't have a functioning government that really cares about you, right? If you have a community where it changes very rapidly, right? Very drastically throughout your lifetime, if you have a polity where different people are coming into it all the time, or the people that you know themselves change really differently, do you really have a country?